Growing up, I drank the Kool-Aid of my parents' and community's beliefs. I made that belief system more important than my own needs and happiness. Looking back, I can't fault anyone for that, not even quote-unquote God. I now have clarity in decisions and choices I make. I'm fully engaged in finding joy in my life, in my own way, without the influence and construct of others. This is an uplifting discussion from there to now.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to I Drank the Kool-Aid podcast. And today it's about Mormonism, a particular person's perspective on it. And his name is Dave. I know Dave through a networking group that we're in Southern Utah. And he and I just did a little one-to-one over beer and wine. And he just shared his story about how he no longer practices Mormonism, also known as the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, also known as LDS. Is there any other words?
I don't know. I know they don't like the term Mormon anymore, but it's hard for me to get that out of my vocabulary.
Well, I think it's pretty well known throughout the world as Mormons and not the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which is why I'm using that term in this podcast.
And I'm fine with that. I mean, I identify now as kind of an ethnic Mormon.
Ooh.
And somebody said, what does that mean? And I said, well, it's kind of like there's a lot of Jews who they don't practice Judaism, but their cultural background is steeped in Jewish tradition. My background is steeped in Mormon tradition, and I have a lot of, family that's very active and believers and that. And so I've used that term before. People say, well, you seem like you might be a member. Are you a member? Because I'll freely talk about I went on a mission sometimes with people because it's a big part of my life. And then they'll say, oh, so what's going on with you now? And I'm like, you could call me an ethnic Mormon. I'll always have Mormonism in my DNA, but I don't practice the faith.
Right. So the Mormonism vernacular is what you use, and people are like, wait, that sounds so familiar, because there is a particular vernacular when it comes to the Mormon church and the culture. I grew up Mormon also in Las Vegas. It was so different from. Where did you primarily live when you were practicing Mormonism?
I grew up in a small town in northern Arizona, right on the Utah border. Page, home of Lake Powell and the Glen Canyon Dam. And
the Antelope Canyon.
Yep. I spent, back in my day when I was growing up, you didn't have to pay or anything to get there. My friends and I, when we were teenagers, would just take pickup trucks over there and stay for like 3 days.
Oh, that sounds
and
amazing.
just, it was like Lord of the Flies. We would shoot rabbits with 22s and roast them over a spit.
Oh my gosh. That's
so it was kind of an
hardcore
idyllic
and awesome.
Childhood growing up there. There wasn't a lot to do. It's not a Mormon town per se, but the Mormons there was enough of them that they kind of outnumbered all the others together. So the influence was great. Like all the professional people in town tended to be LDS. The school board was heavily dominated by Mormon people and that. And, well, hey, most of my friends growing up were the kids I ran around with at church. So
So we were talking over beer and wine, and you shared with me your experience of why you left the church. You were and what I found really compelling about the story particularly is that you were in a fairly high authoritative position in the church.
I was.
Yes. What was that?
So I was the executive secretary to the stake president. So, basically that's part of the stake presidency. And
which is over how many wards? 10 to 12?
Yeah, I think we had probably 8 to 10 units in that stake.
And so how many people would you say that's under that in a ward?
Couple 300 per
or
ward.
something.
And I think we had a winter branch there that was for seniors.
And you're in the
well.
Northwest.
No, it was here in Washington, Utah.
Oh, Washington, Utah.
Yeah.
Washington County, Washington, Utah.
Washington City, Utah would have been the Washington, Utah stake.
Which is their blood runs definitely something Mormonism. I want to say blue because that's BYU.
But, one of the kind of one of the things that was more difficult for me was the fact that I couldn't slide out the back door because everyone knew me. My brother was actually in the bishopric of the ward I attended at the time. And so in some ways, I was always kind of jealous of people who were either left when they were teenagers and said, yeah, I'm done with this, I'm not going back. Or I got really involved shortly after leaving with kind of the post-Mormon community. In fact, I started the post-Mormon group here in St. George, and every once in a while I'll run into people that will say, hey, wait, I know who you are. And I'm like, they're like, why don't you come to I'm like, I'm not interested in that anymore. I'm like way past that. But, it's just one of the things I found out because of that. But I was jealous of people who like were converts.
Right.
And when they left, their family all embraced them and celebrated like,
They're like,
finally.
thank God, they stopped drinking the Kool-Aid.
Yeah, and it wasn't that way for me.
Because your whole family generationally were Mormon, right?
Yeah, well, my father was a convert.
Okay.
But sometimes converts are the more
Staunchest.
hardcore, and my mother was a fourth generation Latter-day Saint. And it was really hard on my parents. My dad had a hard time really speaking to me for about 2 years.
How old were you?
I was 38 years old.
And
so
you
this
were
was
married?
20. Yeah, I was married to my first wife at the time. We had 4 little girls. I think my oldest was probably about 13 when we left, and my youngest was around 6. So my 3 oldest were all blessed and baptized. My youngest was only blessed. She never got baptized.
So you were serving as an executive secretary to the stake presidency over 12, 13 wards.
Yeah.
And those wards are congregations, just so anyone
Right.
knows what a ward means. It's not a psychiatric ward or anything.
No.
Although it's a strange name, but that's how they congregate people together.
Call it like in the Catholic Church, it'd be like a parish or something
Right.
like that.
And you said that, how old were your daughters when you made this decision? Because I think you said they were in girls' camp and you were watching
my
how
oldest-
misogynistic all this
Yeah,
was.
my oldest would have turned about 13 at that time. So they would have been like 13, 11, 9, and 6.
And what was this realization that struck you?
Well, if we kind of go back a little bit to put some background into the story, growing up, there was no more staunch believer than I was. And I would say my mother would always say, you're a very spiritual person and that. And I loved like the Book of Mormon stories and church history, which kind of became my downfall, was my love of history and that. And then, I couldn't wait to go on a mission. Like now they let them go at 18. I would have been gone at 18 as well, but I left at 19. Served. This was during the 1.5 year mission. So I spent 18 months in the Idaho Boise mission, which is a lot of people like, I remember when I got my mission call, people were like sad for me. And I didn't really care. I just wanted to serve. And I loved serving in Idaho. And I served all over the state from Weiser, which is on the Oregon border, up to Rigby, which is a little town between Idaho Falls and Rexburg, and spent some time on the reservation in Fort Hall, which was homecoming for me because growing up in Page, it was always, my dad always told us, we're here in Page to help the Lamanites. So
Which is the Native Americans.
So for those of you that don't know what that means, that's what they call them in the Book of Mormon.
Right, and it's the Navajo reservation that's
Yeah, it
there,
was the
right?
Navajo
And
reservation.
it's not that far from the Four Corners.
No, and then I was with the Bannock Shoshone band up in between Pocatello and Blackfoot. But it was kind of while I was on my mission that, I would study things and like, man, I don't know, this doesn't make sense. And then came home and then ended up getting married to a 19-year-old in the Manti Temple. And then we continued my education at Utah State University in Logan. And while I was there, I would go to the library, and I was a history minor, political science major. And I just loved church history. Well, the more I delved into church history, I was like, this is not the history we're taught at church. This is a very whitewashed version, and it bothered me a lot. And then I came across in the Utah State University Merrill Library a book that many people probably have heard of called No Man Knows My History by Fawn Brodie. It was a biography of Joseph Smith. Fawn Brodie was the grandniece of David O. McKay, who had been the prophet of the church. And she got excommunicated for writing this book. And I was always kind of like intrigued. Like, I've always been the kind of person, when you tell me not to do something, I'm a little bit of a maverick, and I want to know, why don't you want me to? So I started reading that book, and I thought, this isn't some satanic book or anything. She's just historically spelling out the history of Joseph Smith, and it's all, can be verified and everything.
Did it involve mushrooms?
That's a different book. That's one of Quinn's books.
I've heard those theories that he was on mushrooms when he had that vision.
The Origins of Hierarchy by Quinn. I love Michael Quinn's books too, by the way. But yeah, as it just kept bothering me. And this is how I would describe this journey that started then. I was afraid and didn't want this to not be true because it was all of my identity, and my wife was fully involved, and we had children. So I would say there was a shelf that was on the back of my brain, and I would put these things on a shelf. But I would know, that everything I'm being taught at church isn't quite the real story, And I kept putting things up on the shelf, and then one day the shelf broke, and I actually felt like a hypocrite and a fraud if I continued going on this path, and I wanted to find my authentic self. So that's what led me to leaving, was that. And I started reading all these other books like Quinn's books, Origins of Power, and that, and I started seeing that throughout history, these were not really inspired men. They were just men. Some of them were good men. Some of them were not very good men. And they were just human beings. And there really was no inspiration involved. And then as I got involved with serving with the bishopric and that stake presidency, I saw how callings were handed out, and I was like, there's no inspiration here.
This is favoritism.
It's desperation, or things like they would go to call an elders quorum president, and it was very important, I found, that the person had just the right job, and that, and if you'll notice,
and the perfect family.
Yeah, Mormon hierarchy, if you're a doctor, a lawyer, you can be like a school teacher or something, but they tend to be professionals in that. You don't see the janitor very often being called, to be a bishop or in those leadership positions. And I'm not saying that never happens, but I think most research would bear that out, that they tend to be business leaders or professionals or whatnot. And that's what they want.
So I just want to clarify what callings are. So in the Mormon Church, people are called, as in called up or requested to serve a particular position in the ward, as in the congregation, leading the primary, the children, or working with the young women's or the young men's, or in the elders quorum, which is the men's group, or there's Relief Society, which is the women's group, and then there's also the leadership of the ward, which is the bishopric and the counselors.
Yes.
And then they have their executive secretary. So those are kind of the structures of what we're talking about.
And it's a lay clergy. So the clergy is not paid. So
right, everyone is service.
Your bishop could be the barber, or he could be an attorney, and they work a full-time job, and they do. And I will tell you, this is one thing that I really discovered after I walked away, was my Sundays were no day of rest.
Yeah,
I was up and at meetings by 7 a.m. and there till 6 p.m. every Sunday. And the best thing I found when I left was I got a 10% pay raise and Sundays off.
Yeah, that's freaking awesome. So I have to say, my very first Sunday when I decided not to go to church anymore and observe the Sabbath day, I went shopping. I went grocery shopping, and I think I got a pedicure or something. And I remember going like this. Oh my God, is this what people do on Sundays? This is so exciting. This is fun. I really enjoy this. Like hanging out at downtown Summerlin in Las Vegas and going shopping on a Sunday morning is one of the best things ever.
I can totally relate. I'll tell you a story of when, right after I left, there was a gentleman who was a member of that stake presidency where I lived, and it was a Sunday, and we were packing up our van to go to like Pine Valley or something. It was a hot summer day, and he stopped by and said, "Hey, I'd really like to talk to you." And I said, "Well, tell me what it is you want to talk to me about." Because he was dressed in his suit and tie, in Sunday attire. And I said, "If it's about the church or why I left or anything, I really don't want to have this conversation. If you're here because you're my friend and you want to check in on me or just, something like that, I'm open to that." Well, and he hemmed around and goes, "Well, I guess this isn't a good time." And I go, "No, not really. I'm heading out with my family." And one of the things that I found when I left the church is I didn't really have real friends and relationships. I had acquaintances and assigned friends. Because when we left, it was a big deal. I remember someone said, "The bishop said not to go trick-or-treating at your house," and all this stuff. It was just ridiculous things like that. And then one day my then 10-year-old daughter was riding her bike down the street, and some kid came out of his house and said, "Carol Ann, they told us in primary that you're going to hell and we shouldn't talk to you." And she says, "That's okay. I don't believe in hell."
That's beautiful.
And that is the big part of my story is my girls, for whatever reason, were very, and I don't know, I shouldn't say whatever reason, their parents tried to be open-minded and search for truth. But my kids were always like, that particular kid always got kicked out of primary for asking questions that the teacher didn't like and things like that. So, in talking about those girls, I kind of, for about a year or two, became what I'd call like a sunstone Mormon. So that these are intellectual people that sometimes they're just cultural Mormons.
A sunstone is associated with one of the cornerstones of the temple, right?
Yeah, the Nauvoo temple. And then there's a magazine and there's a society and they're the intellectuals in that. And I felt like, well, that's me and I'll stay in and I'll just be this cultural Mormon, but I don't really believe. And at that time I felt like it's still the best way to raise your family. Then I was asked to be a priesthood advisor at girls' camp. And my oldest was part of that. So we go to this girls' camp, and I think it was up in Cedar Mountain or something. And I started hearing what they were teaching them. And all I heard about was keep chaste, to get married to a return missionary in the temple and have a lot of babies and blah, blah. And there was nothing about what kind of person you were or personal development or actual things that to me are about morality, how you treat people.
Having respect for women.
Yes, exactly.
There's no respect.
And I just saw that misogyny, and I was raised, I would say, in a more misogynistic type home. And my view started to change. And I went, this is not the place for my daughters. This isn't how they're going to reach their potential. And at that point, I said, I think I'm out. And I went and talked to my wife, and I had been over the years sharing with her different books and things. And so she's like, yeah, that's good. I'm out too. We're good.
Yay. That's easy.
Yeah.
Usually there's like a battle. The one person's in, I completely believe in the church. And the other person's like, I am out.
And then, of course, we did end up divorcing.
How much further down the road?
Just a few years after that. And part of that was she was 19 when she got married. And in some ways, we felt more married to the church in those covenants than we did to each other. We we have some differences in our personalities and things, but I will tell you this: we are still very good friends, and we were co-parents.
That's
through
amazing.
the end. Yeah, a lot of the girls' friends would go, "Why are your parents such good friends and everything?" We are friends. I consider her family. But more like a sister now. I mean, she doesn't have that same role, and we talked every day when the kids were young, and I would date women who were very uncomfortable with that. And I'm like, well, this is part of the deal. We communicate because we have a united front. We're raising these children together. If you don't like that, then this isn't a good thing for either of us. And, but yeah, she's still one of my very best friends. She's a writer and loves to send her writing to me. Can you tell me what you think of this? And yeah, all very friendly terms. I mean, there was heartache and problems with that, but my current wife and her, they're very friendly. And there were times when she still lived in this area that my wife would say, oh, let's invite her over for dinner tonight. And,
that's awesome.
And, we can all be together in the same room. And it's, in fact, when she got remarried, my current wife and I catered her wedding.
I love that. Peace and harmony forever. So how did you break the news to the stake president? And I love the story of how you broke the news to the bishop.
It's a good story. Since I was his executive secretary, I set the appointment for myself, and my wife and I went in there, and I said, well, you know what? I need to be released from my calling. And he said, well, why is that? And I said, because I can't hold a temple recommend. So I think he was ready for me to reveal this great adultery story or something. And I just said, well, I don't believe Joseph Smith was a prophet. And he said, you know what? That is a problem. You are hereby released. Turn in your temple recommend and your keys. And he gave me a big hug and said, if you ever need me or anything, I'm here for you. And I think he might have been playing good cop at that time. And then, a week or so later, I received a phone call from our bishop. And he says, hey, I need to come talk to you, or you need to come talk to me about your relationship with the church. And I said, okay, I'm willing to do that. Looking back on it, I probably wouldn't have done that, but I still had a lot of the drinking the Kool-Aid that I have to respect his authority and blah, blah, blah. So I went in and then met with the man, and his first question for me was, what do you think of Joseph Smith? And I said, he's a charlatan, a fraud, a sexual predator, and a pedophile. And he was like just taken aback by that kind of description.
Yeah.
And then he said, well, what do you think of the Book of Mormon? I said, well, it's obviously of 19th century origin, probably written by Joseph Smith with the help of some others, and maybe there a little plagiarism from some manuscripts, View of the Hebrews, which was available in the 1830s and that in upstate New York where they were. And I said, and then, the Lamanites are not descendants of ancient Hebrews. Their mitochondrial DNA points back to Asia. And so that's a problem for me. And he had no idea the stuff I was talking about. And he was just kind of aghast by that. And then he said, well, what do you think of the temple? And I said, it's bastardized Masonic ritual.
It is Masonic rituals.
And he goes, what? He didn't know what that meant, and I don't think he was really familiar with Masonry. I happen to have been very familiar because my dad's father, who was not a Mormon, was a Mason.
Mm-hmm.
So
my grandfather was too.
So we knew, I knew this stuff. And he was like, ugh. Well, I just want you to know that you no longer hold the priesthood, and that those 4 little girls at your home will not be with you in the life to come. And at that point, I started to feel abused, and I just put my hands on the desk, and I stood up, and I said, I won't tolerate ecclesiastical abuse, and this interview is hereby over, and I'm going to go home to my family. And he says, well, you understand we're going to have to hold a court and excommunicate you. And I said, no, you're not, because I've already sent in my resignation. And once I've done that, you really can't do that. There's actually some precedent about that and everything. And that flustered him a little bit more. And so my experience with him was a little bit different than the stake president. I didn't feel the love. I just felt condemnation.
Probably because he's super ignorant. Didn't you say he's just a really ignorant person anyways?
Yeah, I felt like he didn't have a lot of education to know about
he's not well read.
A lot of people aren't the voracious reader that I am, and I've probably forgotten more about Mormon history than the average Mormon even knows, or they know something and I'm like, well, there's more to the story that you don't know about.
I need to get you in contact with one of my friends. He and his wife live in Hilldale, but he actually worked at BYU in the library in the section where there was the restricted books no one had access to. And he read some of it and he was going to everyone going, we should share this. We should tell people about this. And then that's when they excommunicated him.
So, one of the things that has always bothered me is why not just tell the truth about the history? If the church is what it says it is, we'll stand that, right? And I also know a lot of people that could care less. I think my brother is a person, like when we would have conversations, he goes, well, that's just history. And I'm like, I don't really understand what you mean by that.
I think people really love the culture of the church, the Mormon Church.
And that's one thing I really want to point out. If you're happy and it fulfills your life, I am not here to pull the rug out from under you. I have no desire to do that. I'm not here to tell you that what you're doing isn't right for you. I don't know what's right for you. I know what's right for me. And if you're okay with those things, that's fine. But I go, that stuff bothers me. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that was one of the final nails in the coffin, so to speak, was about that same time I left. They had come out with a new manual for both the Priesthood and Relief Society about Brigham Young. And I start reading it and I'm like, they're making this guy look like he's a monogamist. And I'm like, that's insulting to my intelligence, because most people that I know, whether they be Mormons, non-Mormons, even if they know very little about the church, they know who Brigham Young is from history, and they know he's a polygamist. They know he had plural wives. So why are we hiding this? To me, that's just
for the ignorant people who don't
so disingenuous and so blatantly dishonest to paint him as a monogamist. He's not. He wasn't. And that's okay. Like, my brother, well, it's just history. Well, that's just part of the history. Why are we hiding that from people? This guy knows, everybody knows Brigham Young had more than one wife. Mm-hmm. It's not a secret. I don't know why we're whitewashing that.
Well, and it's not just the Mormon Church that's doing that. It's happening in our schools. It's happening with our U.S. history. I think it's happening in other country histories. I mean, when there's wars, people's cultural identity is pretty much wiped. You think about all of the amazing artifacts that were just destroyed in
history is written by the victors.
In Iraq. Right. Totally true. So where are you at with religion right now? Did you dabble with other religions and look into it, or are you just a non-religious believer?
For about 15 minutes, I would say. And as I would look at other Christian sects and things like that, I would just go, well, this is all the same. There's a lot of the same stuff going on. And there's, as I studied history, and I don't want to offend anybody with this, but
just be yourself,
there is
Dave.
no historical of Jesus actually existing.
Really?
There's some mentions in some of Josephus' writings that were written many years after. I personally came to believe that there was a great rabbi or a culmination of a few, and my views on Christianity came that Constantine wanted to unite the Holy Roman Empire, and he used Christianity to do that. Had he chosen something else, Druidism or something, most of the Western world would be Druids. Mm-hmm. And again, if Christianity works for you and that, I love the teachings of Jesus, but I honestly feel most people I know that claim to be Christians, they don't follow Jesus's teachings. They're very far from that.
Yeah, in their behavior and their beliefs.
Yeah, and just their arrogance and their so judgy of other people. So just to kind of come back around to that, I would call myself probably an agnostic in that I'm not going to say a flat out atheist because I don't know all the answers, and it's arrogant for me personally. I have many friends they're definitely atheists, but hey, there could be something more out there. I don't know what that is. And I'll tell you this, when I was a Mormon, I was scared to death of death because I felt like, man, what if I'm never good enough? And that's one of the problems in Mormon culture is the perfectionism. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of people are walking around feeling bad about themselves because there's just so many expectations on you. And, as I looked at that with clearer eyes coming out, I just realized there's good probably in all religions. And I do feel somewhat spiritual, but my spirituality has taken where I feel I'm connected to nature now. Mm-hmm. And that's where I feel if there is a loving God out there, that's where I'm going to find it. And I'll tell you my favorite place in the world, and people, if they know where this is, would probably laugh, Beaver Dam Wash. Mm.
Where exactly in Beaver Dam Wash?
I go right in the National Conservation Area.
Oh, nice. You off-road to it then.
Yep. And I sit under those Joshua trees. And I have a connection to those trees. People talk about their spirit animal. Mm-hmm. That's my spirit plant.
I love trees too.
And I feel a peace, and that's where I go to think about things or to meditate. And I'm just more into those things now. And some people, well, aren't you worried about when you die? No, I'm not. And they're like, well, my mother said something to me like shortly after, well, I don't want any empty chairs in the celestial kingdom. And I'm like, do you really believe in a God that would separate the love from a mother and a son in the next life? Like I can't really jive with that.
Yeah.
Like it doesn't make sense to me. And then,
doesn't.
Well, what do you think about the next life? And I go, I don't know. And I'm okay with that. It's just the next great adventure.
Yeah.
Whatever happens after this, if it's lights out, I'm okay with that. I don't have any control over it. If it's reincarnation, if it's we're reunited with loved ones, I'm good with any of it. I don't have any control over it. And I don't fear that anymore. But with my religious upbringing, it made me nervous a lot of times about, whoa, what's going to happen after, maybe I'm not good enough. Maybe I haven't lived up to all of this. And I feel good to have taken those shackles off.
I love that because I find others, when they are in a religious group, they are definitely living a little bit more by fear than normal.
They live for the next world. They don't live in the now.
In the present.
And now I live for now.
Nice.
I'm not worried about what's going to happen after I die.
Right.
I don't care. I don't have any control over it anyway.
Well, and my perspective is if you really believe that you're only living one life, one and only life, why are you not taking care of your body better?
Yeah.
And why are you not having fucking a fun time every day and saying no to things and enjoying experiences and living your life to the most fullest? And when it comes to certain religious practices, it's extremely limiting and restricting. So you're really not even living a joyful life.
I agree. I'm not as religious, of course, as I once was. I feel like I'm a better person, a better human being overall.
More compassionate, empathic?
More empathy, more love.
There's nothing really to judge people by on a barometer.
Yeah, and I have to tell you, I have no hate towards Mormon people, Latter-day Saint people. I take everybody at face value and I just love them. I have problems with the institution, but not with the people. And a lot of people will say just the opposite. Well, the church is perfect, but the people aren't. I'm like, I love the people until they prove to me that I shouldn't.
Right. So basically what we need to do is strip everyone's labels and faces and garb and then literally just approach them as who they are as a person, regardless of what their
That is
belief systems
absolutely
are.
what I try to do with others.
Yeah.
I don't make any judgment right off about people. And let me know who you are. And I don't have any hate for anyone, but I will cut you out of my life if I feel like you're toxic.
Yeah. Well, I love this. Thank you, Dave, for this open, honest conversation.
Oh, it was great. I really enjoyed it.
And I really appreciate you sharing and coming on. This is great. And I enjoyed this conversation very much. And we will be talking way more about this stuff and just religion in general.
Awesome. Sounds
Thank
good.
you for listening to the I Drank the Kool-Aid podcast. Join us next time. If you'd like to participate in this discussion, get a hold of us at idrankthekoolaidpodcast@gmail.com. Now let me ask you, what flavor of Kool-Aid are you drinking?
This has been a production from a podcast studio.